Today, we're going to talk about John chapter 21. If you have a bulletin, you saw in the bulletin, I put there 10 life lessons from John 21. I wanted to really close out. I challenged you about a month ago to read one chapter a day, each day until we led up to Easter in John chapter 21. Did any of you have an opportunity to do that? Did any of you read at least one? Oh, there you go. Okay, I give everybody an opportunity to at least read one chapter. If you hadn't, you can go back and do it. Well, we celebrated Easter last week. We had a fantastic celebration service. And we're going to close today as we look at John chapter 21. Now, I'm not going to read the entire chapter to you, although I want you to understand the story. Okay? We've talked about how the gospel writers tell us the story of Jesus. And in John, we have this little caveat about what happens after Jesus' resurrection. The other three gospel writers don't have a lot to say about it, except for Luke tells us the story about the two travelers on the road to Emmaus. But John is a more personal gospel written by John, the beloved disciple, and so we have a little bit of insight into what's going on. So in John chapter 21, we basically have the story that's titled in the subtext of your Bible, the reinstatement of Peter, some Bibles would say. But it's a story, and I want to kind of tell you the story. Basically what happens is, Jesus appears to the disciples. I'm going to start in verse 21, and I'm going to read just a few passages of it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It says, later Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there, and he goes off to name 7 of them. He says, in verse 3, interestingly enough, Simon Peter says to his partners, the 7 others, I'm going fishing. We'll come too, they said. So they all go out on the boat, but they catch nothing all night. So we're introduced to the story. Now remember, Jesus has resurrected. He appeared to the disciples in Jerusalem. He told them, if you remember from the story, to go to Galilee and wait for him there. We know that he appeared on the road to Emmaus to the two travelers, but at this point, the risen Christ has not really he's not known to them at all points. He tells them to go there. We've only got, this is the 3rd visit time where we see him, so the disciples are still really trying to figure out what to do. And it's important, I think, here to think about their life. They've seen Jesus resurrected, but they don't really know what this means totally. You know, the disciples, most of them were fishermen, some of them were other things, but the chances are that the last 3 years of their life, they have been traveling around with Jesus on his ministry, and they didn't know exactly what it was, but they certainly thought it was something going to end in a different way than what we just experienced at Easter. And so it's very likely that over the course of this last 3 years, they've been kind of living off of donations from people, you know, who they're out going on this ministry, doing different things here and there. So they go back to where they're from. They're from Galilee, and they decide to go fishing. At dawn, and we know they on this fishing trip, they fished all night, they didn't catch anything. At dawn, Jesus is standing on the beach, but the disciples don't really know who he is. We don't know if that's because he looks a little bit different as the risen Christ, or if it's just the mist of the sun, it's early morning. It doesn't tell us. But he calls out to them. He says, fellas, have you caught any fish? No, they replied. Then he said to them, throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll get some. So they did. And they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Interestingly enough, they didn't know it was Jesus, but they took this advice and they did what the person on the bank said. Some historians have said that oftentimes that when you were in a boat, some of these fishermen, they cast nets into schools of fish, that maybe they thought the person on the bank could see a school of fish, maybe moving along the shoals, and told them. We don't know. All speculation. But when they go to get the net, it's full. At this point, ding, 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 a few lights go off, right? We've got some things that maybe come to mind here. And then we see here that the disciple Jesus loved in verse 7, just a point of note, that's John. He doesn't like to refer to himself directly, so in his gospel he says, then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, what does he do? He puts on his tunic, for he had stripped down. He was probably just in his undergarment because he's been working all night. He jumps into the water and he rushes to the shore, while the others stayed with the boat to pull in this full net of fish. The text tells us they were about 100 yards from shore when this happens. When they get there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire, and some bread. We go to find out that they catch 153 fish. Jesus tells them, hey, bring some of the fish you've caught. A lot of people don't realize this. Interestingly enough, there's fish cooking already. Where Jesus get them? We don't know that. I mean, but at the end of the day, Jesus doesn't need you or me to do his thing. You know, we oftentimes feel like God needs us. God uses us, but God doesn't need us. You know what I mean? He's got his thing going. He's going to do his thing, and he invites you and I to participate in it. He invites them to bring some of their fish to the little breakfast he's cooking, but he's already got his own fish. And he's got Peter over there, but he tells them to do that. I want you to know, we'll talk about this in a minute. So Peter goes over back to the boat, and he drags the net all the way. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But so what happens is they're in the boat, they fished all night, they've caught nothing, they're coming into the shore. The Bible tells us that it's dawn, which is the time whenever they're not going to be fishing, and they can't tell who it is, but somebody says, hey, throw your net over to the right. They throw the net, it's full of fish, 153, we find out later. When they realize it's full of fish, John recognizes, hey man, this is Jesus. Peter's like, what? Throws on his tunic, jumps in the water, goes over there. Jesus already has some fish cooking over a charcoal fire. We'll talk about that in a minute. And over the fire, they get there. When the boat gets there, Peter leaves the fire and he goes back and he starts and he drags the net the rest of the way over. And that's where we find. After breakfast, so they come over for some breakfast, and Jesus says, hey, all y'all come eat a little breakfast. Bring some of your fish too. But nobody asked him, who are you? Because they all knew it was the Lord. Excuse me. Now, then we enter verse 15. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Interestingly, Jesus has not addressed Peter as Simon, son of John, like this in a while. It's a very unique address. Okay, so we know here that there's something a little more formal about what Jesus is doing. He doesn't, he had told him, no, you're no longer going to be this, you're going to be Peter, upon whom I'm going to build my church. But he addresses him in his old formal name, Simon, son of John. Do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know that I love you. Now, if you understood Greek, there is an interesting little caveat here. So Jesus asks him, do you love me? And he uses the term agape, which is this God big love. Jesus responds, or Peter responds with the term phileo, which is really, I love you kind of as my friend, which is interesting. Peter replies, I love you, I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeats the question a second time. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter says, you know that I love you. Then take care of my sheep, he says. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? The Bible says Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And so Jesus told him, feed my sheep. Clearly, I think Peter's beginning to understand a third time he asks him, right? It wasn't that long ago that what? In front of a charcoal fire, we find in Matthew's gospel and in the gospel of John that Peter's standing around this fire whenever the people around say what to him? Aren't you one of him? And 3 times Peter did what? I don't even know that dude. One time the gospel says with curses, he says, I don't even know the man. So Peter, this flood of emotion we know has to be coming back to Peter right here in front of his peers. Jesus asks him 3 times, Simon, do you really love me? Do you really mean it? Peter was hurt by this, but ultimately his Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus tells him, feed my sheep. And then we find this interesting couple of verses here I want to read to you. He says, I tell you the truth, Jesus says to Simon, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. We know from church tradition and from history that ultimately Peter's death was crucifixion. And the story says that he chose to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to be crucified in the same way as Jesus. And so this is an allusion to that reality. Jesus said this to let him know, and he said to follow me. Very interesting. Peter then turns around after this very formal, very interesting exchange. You know, Peter had been the guy who said to Jesus, I'll do whatever. These other cats may fall by the wayside. These other cats may let you down. All these other cats are not going to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to stand by you. Then in the moment of truth, we know what? He didn't stand by him. So Jesus, he has to kind of reopen this little wound back. But he comes in here, and there's where we get this concept of Jesus reinstating Peter. He tells him that, hey, you're going to have some troubles. And then watch what Peter does. Peter turns around and he looks behind at the disciple that Jesus loved. We know is John. And John, we know, there's a reference here. It says, the one who had leaned over to Jesus during supper and asked, Lord, who will betray you? So, in this moment of very great importance, even in this, Peter turns around to look at John, and he's worried about what John's doing. He says, what about him, Lord? Jesus replied, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? As for you, follow me. And then so the rumor spread among the community of believers that this disciple, being John, wouldn't die, but that isn't what Jesus said at all. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? And then we have the closing of John's gospel. It says, this disciple is the one who testifies to these events and has recorded them here. And we know that his account of these things is accurate. Jesus also did many other things. If they were all written down, I suppose the whole world could not contain the books it would be written. So, this is the close to John's gospel. This very interesting story of Jesus making an appearance. We know that from one of the other gospels and even from Acts that this isn't the final episode of Jesus with the disciples. He has his ascension. But in this particular episode, where Jesus brings Peter back into the fold, there are 10 life lessons that I want us to remember. I want you to write these down because you will either need these very soon in your life or at some point these will be helpful to you. Not for yourself, but from others. The first thing, and these are super practical, by the way. I'm not claiming to be some great theological, religious person in this, but I think there are some truths here that we see from this story. The first life lesson that I see right here is this. When you don't know what to do what you know. Where do I get that from? Look, the world has fallen apart for Peter. It's gone to hell in a handbasket. And what does he do? He goes fishing. Because he knows how to fish. And that's what he was taught to do. That's his job. Listen, way too many people in life are waiting to do something instead of doing what they know to do. Look, if you're in a place in your life where you don't know what to do, just do what you know how to do. And let God handle the rest. Listen, nothing worse than people who are just wandering around waiting for something. Look, do something and do what you know. Now that seems so simple, but man, I can't tell you the number of people in my life that if they would just follow that one little piece of practical advice, it would help them. When you don't know what to do, then just do what you know how to do. Number 2, be open to friendly advice. Look, there's a lot of people that can't go forward because they just won't listen to people. Look, in this particular story, Jesus is not recognized by them for whatever reason. We don't know the exact reason, but we do know because the Bible says they don't recognize it. But this guy from the shore calls out to them and he says, hey, you guys ought to try to throw your net on the other side. He just gives them a little friendly advice. They listen. Listen, be open to friendly advice. You don't always have to take it, but some people are so closed-minded they can't ever learn. They can't ever grow. They can't ever accomplish because they're too smart or they're too whatever to listen to friendly advice. Listen, always be open to friendly advice. Number 3, some of the best things in life are not planned or expected. Listen, the disciples were not planning on catching a monster catch off the right side of that boat at daylight. They had planned to try to catch them that night when you're supposed to catch fish. Their expectation coming in to that shore was about like what I had yesterday at about 10:30. When I hadn't got a single bite on Cane River. Since the second cast, I had thrown, and I had zero expectation that I was going to catch one, even though Bob kind of told me where the hot spot was. I didn't have any high expectations. But sometimes the best things in life happen not planned or expected. You got to be ready for those. Number 5. 4. There you go. Thank you. Keep me straight. Number 4. Sometimes you have to just do it. You can't wait. Look, Peter teaches us that right here. Peter is in this boat. And at the moment of time that John recognizes Jesus, Peter makes the leap. And that's so true in life. Sometimes you just got to do something. You can't wait around and analyze and wait to figure it out. You just got to do it. You got to act. And that's so important. Some people in life are paralyzed in inaction because they're not willing to take that leap. They're worried about what? Maybe getting their clothes wet. They may not whether they're cold, whether he's right or whatever. Look, Peter shows us here, sometimes you just got to go for it. You got to do it. You can't wait around. Number 5. This is an interesting one that I've never seen from this story, but I really feel that the Lord showed me this. Number 5. Always do your part. The text tells us in 2 little verses, all right, Peter jumps out of the boat because he's got to go see Jesus, and he is impulsive, and he's going to make that move right now. And it says in some translations that he left them to do what? You got 153 fish. They got to do the work to get them to the bank now. What does Peter do after he gets to the bank and the boat gets there? The text goes out of its way, grammatically, literally, to say Peter leaves the fire where he's been with Jesus, and he goes back to the boat, and he carries the fish from the boat to the fire. You know why? Because he was doing his part. There's nothing worse than people in life who don't do their part. They don't carry their fair share of the load. All they ever want to do is take. And look, there's a lot of takers. And the worst kind of takers to me are the spiritual takers who are so spiritual because they're always whatever. Listen, sometimes doing your part is doing a little work. You know what I'm saying? Don't get lost in the spiritual or something and thinking you're better than doing your part when hard work comes along. Look, we're supposed to, as Christians, do our part. Let me tell you what, there's a lot of people who have reservations about God and the church and Christianity because they have seen a lot of Christians who didn't just do their part. They weren't even just good people. Look, just do what you're supposed to do. Don't leave something for everybody else to do. Carry your share of the load. Number 6, don't let your past determine your future. Look, if we learn anything from this story, this is probably one of the most important points. Peter's past is brought to the surface here, and it's not good. Listen, he denied Jesus. I don't know that guy. This was a bad deal. And surely some of the disciples probably reminded him of that, right? Yeah, okay, big talker, you can talk all about it, but can you deliver whenever the moment's there? I may have ran, but I tell you what, I didn't curse Jesus. And so he had a past. But listen, we learn from here that your past doesn't have to determine your future. How many people in life, their future is diminished or paralyzed because they're stuck with what happened to them in the past? Listen, if you've got things in your past that are holding back your future, you got to go to Jesus and you got to give him those. And you got to let him work out what needs to happen. Number 7. True love for God is obedient action. Listen, Miss Marlene and I have this kind of interesting connection. Her dad loved the hymn, Trust and Obey. And we've talked about how his mantra in life was obey. You got to obey. Listen, that's so true. If you want to really love God, the way to do it is obedient action. Listen, words mean nothing without action. That's why Jesus told Peter what? He asked him, you definitely got to say it. You got to give account with your mouth. And do you love me? Well, yeah, I love you. Then do what? Follow through. Obey. Feed my sheep. Listen, all of us as Christians, if we want to love God, we have to obey his teachings. And unfortunately, what we do is we create these kind of areas in our life where we kind of close those off, and guess what? We can never get closer to God, because until we move forward in obedient action, we're stuck. Number 8. Sometimes the truth hurts. Listen, what does it say right there? A third time he asked, do you love me? And what does it say? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. Listen, sometimes the truth hurts. And you got to experience a little pain to grow. You can't just always tell everybody what they want to hear. You can't just give them a sugar-coated version of everything. If you do, you're lying to them. You know, one of my failures in a number of aspects of my life is I sometimes don't want to be confrontational, or I don't want to address an issue, and I'm trying to skirt around somebody's feelings. By nature, I don't want to do that. Some of you are great at that, okay? But I need to get better, and if you need to get better, sometimes the truth hurts. And you're not helping people if you let them propagate a lie and continue living in some false reality. You know, now, I'm not saying you got to come in with a wrecking ball and do it in a wrong spirit or in the wrong kind of way. But listen, Jesus didn't back down here. He's like, hey, do you really mean it? I mean, you said it before. Do you really mean it? And it caused Peter a little pain. And you know what? That's okay. You know how many people are scared of a little pain? Listen, pain is sometimes the only path to get you where you need to go. Listen, for your kids, sometimes a little pain is what it takes to get their mind right, to get them where they need to go. If everything is always good and you always affirm everything that they do, let me promise you this now. They will not end up where they need to be. And guess what? In your life, if you don't experience a little pain and a little hurt, because you have done some things that it should hurt you to remember. You've hurt other people. You've not done what you should. You've done things that you shouldn't. Guess what? And it should hurt you a little bit when you remember that. But go back ahead. You don't let that determine and dictate your past. You got what? You got to release that. And Jesus certainly wasn't trying to throw it back in Peter's face so he held on to it. What was he doing? He was trying to let him throw it back out there so he could address it and move forward. Listen, so many people can't ever go forward because they're stuck and they won't address what happened. Look, sometimes when someone has hurt you, you need to go and address that. They may not respond or deal with it the way you want to, but just by you addressing it, being truthful, you can let it go and you can move forward. Sometimes you're on either end of that stick, but let me just tell you, denial and burying it never helps. That's not the way to go. Sometimes the truth hurts. Number 9, following Jesus is not the easy path. Listen, do not fall victim to the people who get on TV or who tell you that if you follow Jesus, everything's going to be great. Let me just tell you, the founder of Christianity, where'd he end up? There's a lot of things about that aren't great. Greatness came from it, but that was a path of a lot of heartache, a lot of suffering. Peter in the story, Jesus says, follow me, but where does he tell him he's going to be following me to? To one of those, upside down. Listen, following Jesus is not the easy path. Now, is it worth it? Man, you better believe it. Will it lead to something greater than you've ever imagined? Unquestionably. Will you get to the end and be willing to make be glad you made that sacrifice? Absolutely. But it will not be the easy path. I'll never forget the line from this song, a band I used to love when I was in college. Some of you heard of a band called Caveman's Call. Have you ever heard of that band? Kind of a little band that was out in the 90s, way back then. Some of you weren't even born. But they had a line in there that says this line that sticks with me says, sometimes you have to walk the mountain rocky path to see the ocean view. And I think about that when I think about sometimes the path Jesus calls us to follow. It's not easy. Sometimes it's rocky. Sometimes it's treacherous. And it certainly does not always lead us into the valley of comfort and peace and serenity. Sometimes it's a rocky mountain road. We know from when he was here, he told us that many times there will be very few travelers on it. And that the vast majority of travelers won't choose that path. But listen, it's the path that leads to life. And it's the path that ultimately, in my experience, leads to the greatest views. And finally, number 10. Look, mind your own business. Don't get distracted by others. Listen, look at Peter. Peter's right here in the moment. Peter's being reinstated by Jesus, and even Peter, in this crescendo of opportunity, Jesus has brought him back in, instilled in him the fact that he's kind of to lead this new band of followers. Peter doesn't realize it, but he's even telling him you're going to have a martyr's death. And what does Peter do in the moment? What about him? Man, look, just mind your business. Don't get distracted by others. How many people in life, myself included, have gotten distracted from my own cause and my own path because I'm doing what? Worried about what everybody else is doing. Now, I'm not talking about genuine concern. Listen, there are some people who have that gift, right? And listen, I mean, they're helping people, and they're like the brokers of positive information, right? They're helping people, and they're coordinating, and they're bringing people together, and they're doing that. Look, I see that all the time, and that's awesome. That's not what I'm talking about. If you follow the text, what Peter's worried about is he better than John, or who's that? Don't worry about what God's doing with somebody else. Listen, man, you ought to just champion anything God's doing for other people. And don't get worried about what they're doing. Listen, at the end of the day, let me tell you something. When you stand before your Maker, when you have to give an account for what you've done, listen, when you look back, there ain't going to be anybody else there. There's not going to be anybody else to point a finger at. There's not going to be anybody else to champion your cause but one. And that's Jesus. And so I want to challenge you that I'll take all this practical advice, and when you start formulating how all this applies to you, listen, make sure that you're living your life in such a way that the man from the cross is on your side and he's with you in what you're doing. Because I'm going to tell you, there's going to come a point for every person where you're going to need it. And everything will depend on whether he's there for you. How's he going to be there for you? That's what I'm going to talk about next week. By trusting in him, believing in him, confessing your sins, being baptized. Listen, Josh really drove this home today. Don't get caught up in all the things that are exciting, right? Look, I can't wait to see this movie with my son. We've seen all the other ones. I love fall. I get excited about fishing. I get excited about hunting. That's part of life, man. Life is flows in these ebbs and flows. But listen, don't get so excited about all of that you forget what really matters. And that's what you've done for God and for Jesus. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you would help each of us to learn from this story how to apply some of these lessons in our own life. We certainly need help. Forgive us, Lord, for our own mistakes, where we don't do what we should and we get tripped up like Peter and make mistakes. I pray, Lord, you would help us to recognize your presence in our life and to do everything we can to obey you in our actions. We ask this in your name. Amen. Appreciate you being here today. A lot of things going on this week that you need to know about. They're up there. Take a look at that kind of stuff. Look, next week, I want you to try to invite somebody. I really am going to be talking about something that I think will apply to a lot of people. It'll be a great opportunity for folks maybe who haven't been to church a lot. You can tell them, a little call. It's going to be, what is your end game? So we'll be talking about that next week. I want to invite you to be a part of that. If you see somebody who's not here, the number of folks are out sick, give them a shot. Maybe send them a text. Just let them know that we missed them. I do appreciate you being here on this Sunday to worship with us. Bob, would you lead us in our closing prayer, sir?